Fantastic. Well, thank you all so much for joining this webinar. On behalf of Onfido, I'm delighted to host this afternoon on the topic of RegTech, and whether it's a buzzword or something more than that, an effective compliance facilitator. So my name's Matt Peake. We're going to cover a whole range of themes this afternoon related to RegTech. We're going to look at how useful it is as a concept and in practice, some benefits and barriers and innovation and future trends. And we're also going to review some findings from research that KPMG has recently done in this space, and to really just try and drill into some areas in terms of what we think the future holds for us. A little bit of housekeeping before we start. So it'd be great to try and make this an interactive session. So if you have any questions or any thoughts or comments, do feel free to put them into the chat, and we will make sure that we integrate those and address them during the presentation and the overview or at the end. But you'll be pleased to know that it's not just me speaking today. I'm joined by two fantastic panelists. This is a conversation in conjunction with Innovate Finance and KPMG, and so I'm delighted to welcome two speakers to help me to talk this through. If we go to the next slide, we have Chris Steele, who leads the KPMG in the UK's RegTech community of interest. And he also leads the regulatory team covering a broad range of risk and regulatory issues, which include leading regulatory change projects and a range of financial services clients, many of which involve the implementation of technology solutions. So welcome, Chris. And we also have Rachel Waggott, who is the head of regulatory affairs at Innovate Finance. Innovate Finance being a not-for-profit trade association representing and advancing the global fintech community with cross-industry stakeholders such as regulators, government, investors and institutions to champion the benefits of RegTech and address the barriers to adoption and scaling. And of course myself, Matt Peake, and I head the policy function at Onfido. And for those that aren't familiar, Onfido is a remote identity verification company, making sure that people are who they say they are online. So without further ado, if we can go to the next slide, what we want to do is to pitch a series of questions, which we'll talk through as a group, and then also hopefully get your thoughts and comments on. First of all, what we think RegTech looks like in terms of the market. And I'll just sort of set a few pointers, and then I'll get the views of Chris and Rachel. From our perspective at Onfido, RegTech is all about compliance and making sure that companies can use technologies and innovative cutting-edge technologies most of the time to better comply with regulation. And the way that we see that from our perspective internally is that it's all to do with compliance in the financial services sector and anti-money laundering and fraud prevention, compliance requirements for fintech and financial services customers. But more broadly than that, we also see our services being used to fight fraud and used for creditworthiness assessments and many other areas of the financial services ecosystem. And over time, the performance levels of automated technologies such as AI and biometrics, which are central to what Onfido does, have improved. And the performance improves, and so we're also seeing now the range of use cases and the scope of the possibilities of RegTech increase as a result. And for example, we're now seeing regulators themselves look at how they can use AI to improve the services that they offer and to drill through lots of data. And we're also seeing new markets develop, for example, the Online Safety Bill in the UK, which will introduce requirements on large platforms or adult content services to verify age and make sure that children aren't getting into services they're not allowed to. And so RegTech in that space can offer a really interesting possibility to be able to verify age and identity online. So I think in terms of the way that we see RegTech evolving, the use cases are developing all the time. The improvement in the performance means that it's becoming a more trusted and a more accepted type of technology that's being used also from a user experience perspective. And so we see that demand growing and the use cases growing alongside it. So that's a little bit about where we as Onfido see that, and I'd love to get perhaps Chris your thoughts as well from the KPMG perspective on what you see in terms of the market for RegTech.
Thanks very much, Matt. That's great. Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me on. So with the RegTech market, I guess what we see at the highest level is a fantastically innovative and creative sector. And I think to your point around the broader benefits, Matt, it's one that's got the potential to deliver huge benefits to the UK economy and also to the wider society. Some of those benefits that perhaps people don't think about when they immediately think of RegTech, the anti-fraud benefits, for example. But yeah, it's easy for me to sort of say that. And one of the things we do look at, though, to try and assess the health of markets, and the RegTech market, as an example, is a metric around investment levels. And this is, I think, an interesting bellwether for us to talk about for a moment, because from a RegTech perspective, that investment shows that this sector is really a bright spot in what is a potentially a slightly gloomy broader fintech technology and financial services picture. I think many of you also listeners on the call will be aware that over the last 3 years we've seen those investments in the broader fintech space peak in 2021 before dipping slightly in 2022 in line with those broader technology sector trends. However, RegTech it really bucked that trend. It showed a lot more resilience. It had a record year last year from an investment perspective, with nearly $19 billion invested into the sector versus the previous record the year before of $12 billion. So I think that's one of the questions we're going to be discussing today with Rachel and Matt is, why is the RegTech sector more resilient? What's at the heart of that? But at the risk of giving away a spoiler as to which side of the fence I'm going to fall on Matt's question of is it a buzzword or is it an effective enabler and tool? In a nutshell, I believe that resilience reflects the critical importance of RegTechs to helping financial institutions manage their broad regulatory compliance obligations. And that resilience and that demand is driven by lots of factors, but we're going to discuss and touch on some more of them later in detail. But if I just sort of highlight a couple before coming to Rachel for your thoughts. I mean, first up, I was going to call out the rapidly evolving regulatory regimes around the world. So alongside fraud and financial crime, those core areas of demand we've seen for a long time, we're seeing areas like crypto, data, privacy, and ESG all driving continued interest and investment. And with more change in those areas forecast over the next 12, 24 months, it's not going to get any easier. All of that change creates a huge amount of complexity, and it increases the amount of work that's needed just to remain in compliance with all the changing reg requirements. So I think that's a really strong driver for me. The other factors I'd call out would be things like the way we work. The fact that we're doing this webinar as we have for the last 3 years as the way we're doing it, and more so than before. We're still adopting and adapting to these changes. What does this look like? And the changing nature of work is fostering, I think, some of that resilience in the sector. And then the final one, which again we'll talk about in a lot more detail later, I'm sure, is the availability and the use of data and what that does to drive innovation and investment in RegTech. So they're just some of sort of my, I guess my high-level views of the market to set the scene. Rachel, have you got anything you wanted to add to that one?
Yeah, thanks so much. And Matt, thanks for having me here. It's great to be part of this discussion today. Chris, you set a really brilliant kind of macro scene setting piece, so I won't seek to repeat what you've said. I'll give you a bit of a view from the Innovate Finance vantage point and kind of what we are seeing. So I think very much like you say, it's a really compelling story to tell in the UK. There's a really vibrant RegTech ecosystem, and we see providers offering solutions in privacy, cybersecurity, that reg and compliance management, sustainability, ESG, to name a few. But what we were really hearing from our members in the wider ecosystem is that they are coming up against barriers to scale and adoption, which isn't unique to the UK, but it's something that we at Innovate Finance in particular wanted to help address. And that was one of the reasons we partnered with Chris and team at KPMG. So last year we published our RegTech report, which I'm sure we'll kind of unpack in more detail. But positive story overall, really great, success stories, but a little bit more to do in the UK space certainly is what we are seeing in terms of, really unpacking those issues around scaling and adoption.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Chris and Rachel. You've picked on some really, really interesting points, in particularly access to data and barriers. And there are definitely some areas that I think we can definitely talk a little bit more about later. If we can go on to the next slide, I think one of the sort of interesting things that's come out recently, Chris, is your KPMG report in this space on RegTech. And it would be really great to sort of get your sense of the key findings from that in terms of what you saw and what that sort of brought out in terms of key areas and key learnings for all of us really in this space, if possible.
Yes, sure, I'm happy to do that. And just, I guess, to build on Rachel's comments, because the heart of the conversation today around some of the barriers and perhaps the reasons why RegTech is not at the level we would expect it to potentially be at to fulfill its potential is the kernel of what we found, what we thought we would find, and hopefully we've got some ideas and some thoughts we can share with everyone today about how we can overcome some of those barriers and how RegTech can work to fulfill its potential. So, a bit of a start with the question as to why did Innovate Finance and why did we want to feel the need to write another paper on RegTech, because there is a lot of literature out there already, including some papers written by us. Well, the simple reason is that despite some of the successes we're going to talk about today, the adoption of technology in the regulatory compliance space, I think globally, is way below where it needs to be for a thriving, innovative financial services sector. And we really want to try and get under the skin of that, as Rachel said, to try and really unpack some of these issues and try and work towards, with everyone in the ecosystem, some solutions to some of those barriers. So in producing the report, we aim to try and bring wider attention to what RegTech is, what it can be and what it can offer, because there's definitely awareness is one of the barriers that's often cited and raised. So there was definitely an awareness objective. Awareness of some of those business critical use cases of RegTech, yep, absolutely. Along with those core areas like AML, which is serviced by great businesses like yourselves, Matt, on Fido. But those use cases now extend well beyond into more, sort of areas which were in the periphery before. Some of the domains which are, they're existential issues for us, and they're C-suite issues. I've mentioned ESG already, and so is Rachel, but cyber as well, and consumer protection, which is a growing trend in the UK and globally with the FCA's consumer duty in the UK. So that was that first objective around awareness. The second objective was to really try and advance the discussion on how we navigate some of those barriers, some of those well publicized and in many cases long-standing barriers to scale that RegTechs face. And again, we're going to be discussing that in more detail later, so I won't spoil that discussion, but hopefully again that tees things up. But again, Rachel, from the members that you work with, I'm sure lots of those members are raising questions on barriers with you and are discussing them with you. Is there anything you wanted to add on the report or barriers?
I think just an interesting point to me was around, the need to increase digitization of regulatory rule books. That I think is going to be a key piece, and I'm sure it's something we'll build on as we discuss this afternoon. Yeah.
Matt, back over to you then, I think, for the next question.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, Chris and Rachel, for that as well. And a fascinating report. I think it's one which really, really helps to sort of bring a lot of this together, because one of the things that we found is that there's a lot of conversations about RegTech and about these sort of issues that aren't always crystallized concretely, or we have these conversations in lots of different fora. So to be able to bring it together in one report is really excellent, and it's a really great publication. If we go on to the next slide, because I think that leads neatly on to what we as a group see as the benefits for consumers, and we've deliberately called it consumers here rather than businesses. I think there's certainly from the perspective on Fido a huge amount of benefit to be derived from the RegTech proposition, both for end users but also for businesses themselves. I mean, from the on Fido perspective, we certainly see as a B2B company that we have a lot of feedback about our services being incredibly useful in terms of efficiency and being able to onboard, and particularly being able to onboard users much more quickly, but also with a huge degree of accuracy, while ensuring privacy and security, which is absolutely fundamental these days. And the ability to be able to use the technologies that exist out there, to be able to sort of overcome some of the manual, the high friction processes that we typically associate with verifying people, is absolutely front and center of where we see the benefits for customers. And also it's very, very important, obviously, to make sure when you're verifying people, you are doing in a way which is highly inclusive. And so people with disabilities, people who might be subject to bias, for example, people who are not always able to use these services in the way that everybody can. It's really, really key that as a business and as an industry, we're thinking about how we mitigate some of those issues. And so we as a business have done a lot of work looking at bias and inclusivity, and how we can sort of overcome the traditional preconceptions that some people have about how those sort of things are dealt with. But then on a sort of more business focused level as well, we see a lot of focus now on fraud and how you're preventing fraud from entering your ecosystem. And so we do a lot of work as a business looking at what we call passive signals, right? So it's great if you can check someone's identity when they join, but there's also a very, very strong interest now, particularly in the fintech and financial services sector, at doing a more holistic review of people and where they are. So for example, you can check against databases, you can check the integrity of their mobile phone. If they're using a mobile phone, you can check whether they're using a VPN system to try and bypass traditional forms of authentication. And so all of those sort of pieces put together are things you wouldn't traditionally get with other means of checking someone's identity. And so from a RegTech perspective, it's a really interesting proposition, and it can also lead to a much better user experience for the end user as well. So that often means that you don't get as much drop off, and you can sort of show very, very clearly to all the different parts of your organization how great that solution is. And that's not just an Onfido thing, that's lots of different RegTech organizations being able to offer those really cool and innovative different technologies. And so there's certainly some of the areas that we see benefits from RegTech, particularly in the financial services sector. And I don't know whether, Rachel, that would also sort of chime with, what you see from other members of Innovate Finance in terms of where they would advocate and see the benefits of this sort of technology as well.
Absolutely. I'd really echo the cost, compliance and user experience points that you've made. That absolutely resonates. And I really wanted to kind of pick up on cost. I think that's key to all the firms that I've been speaking with, so amongst our membership, but also the wider ecosystem. If you think about kind of startup scale-ups, they're often pre-profit, often VC funded, and there's always that cost pressure there. And actually leveraging RegTech brings so many efficiencies. It means they can really kind of double down on their innovative proposition that helps benefit consumers and businesses in the UK. So that's been a huge piece of feedback that we've got. But Chris, really keen to hear your perspectives too.
Yeah, I think you've both touched on some of the main benefits that we've drawn out in our reports. You know, in papers we've spoken about the 5 C's is a sort of catchy way of helping people remember both the drivers and some of the benefits. So you've got the cost, which is clearly the big one we've mentioned a lot already. You've got compliance, you've got complexity, which I've touched on. I'll come back to in a moment. And I guess they were the 3 C's that in the past we've spoken about. More recently, the other 2, which again we've touched on already, are coming into the fore. So the customer experience and the corporate experience. So there are 5 C's. So the cost piece is still obviously huge. Yeah, reducing cost given the environment we're in, using technology to reduce costs, optimize processes. Particularly, I think where we found this is the reason that one has been around as a driver for so long is because it's been slightly more straightforward in the early days where you were dealing with more structured data and where the technology was relatively immature. But as Matt has said, even in these sort of spaces, the world is moving very, very rapidly, and there's much more that can be done in that area. I mean, compliance. I mean, that's my background is risk and compliance, so clearly. The drive to ensure compliance is got to be up there in terms of the benefits. We all know the costs when these things go wrong. I don't need to start quoting fines at you. For those of you on the call that work in this sphere, you'll be very well aware of the costs when things do go wrong. But that complexity piece also, I wouldn't underplay that. Yeah, working with complexity is increasingly important. And what technology does is it gives us the tools and some solutions to react to complexity from a data perspective, yes, but also complexity and speed of movement in the market and all those different factors that are moving around. But if I just unpack those, the two newer, if you like, benefits that we've seen come through, the improved customer experience one is, I think, as Rachel said, and Matt, massive. You know, RegTech, using RegTech as a driver for digital transformation is one of the sort of lines that I explore with many of my clients. So, you know, the outcomes and the objectives that firms are looking for is onboarding a customer faster, getting a product application through faster, you know, making sure that you're delivering good customer outcomes. These are the business benefits rather than doing what I have to do in the past, which is selling a risk reduction goal. So improved customer experience is big, and it does really, as I say, it meshes in with this other important point around how progressive firms are thinking about RegTech in the context of their digital transformation strategies. So not a side project, we have a digital transformation strategy, probably RegTech needs to be a part of that to drive good customer experience. And also to drive the corporate experience, which is the final one. So using RegTech to improve systems and data integration, yes, it can deliver improved customer outcomes, but also enhances the user experience of those of us that work in financial services, enables people to make their jobs a little easier, giving them more time to focus on higher value activities. These are some of the sort of key goals that we have in working with these technologies. So I'd say, yeah, they're the 5 C's. Yeah, again, we can sort of take questions on any of those and dot around, but hopefully that gives you a flavour of what we see as some of those key benefits.
Yeah, that's great, and I think it's really just to pick up on one point you made there. The pandemic for our business was just, you know, fundamentally changed the way that particularly financial services sector firms are thinking about how they onboard customers and how they verify customers to the right levels of assurance. And so what we typically find is that the digital first fintech challenger banks are those that have a real desire to be able to use that amazing RegTech type solution to onboard customers and to provide that amazing UX experience for them. But actually the pandemic sort of forced this fundamental rethink also for the other sort of more traditional banks, and thought, yeah, okay, we really need to also offer that sort of digital first proposition. And so digital transformation was obviously, as we all sort of know, just completely turned on its head as a result of the pandemic, and now no one's going back, right? It's only that sort of way that people are thinking about first by default. So yeah, really interesting observations there. Great. Okay, thanks. If we can go on to the next slide. And we sort of talked a little bit about this already, but great to sort of unpack it in a little bit more detail. There's a lot of issues that I think we find as a business that present either concrete or sort of more vague barriers to either adoption or also to scaling in this space. Maybe I'll let you both sort of have your sort of say first, and then I'll come in with some thoughts at the end. But I don't know, Rachel, if you want to kick us off with some, where do you see the barriers, or your members see the barriers in this space, either actual or perceived?
Yeah, sure. Very happy to kick off. I mean, one of the things that I referred to earlier was this digitization of regulators' rulebooks, and I think that's key. Now, we absolutely recognize the efforts that regulators are making globally. You know, we've got the globe that's looking at both RegTech, but also supervisory tech as well. And in the UK, the Financial Conduct Authority, the FCA, has been doing, you know, tech sprints in this space. So we get it. We recognize that they're kind of trying to drive it forward. But I'd really love to see them going further and faster on this. Not surprised that you hear that from me. And we've got examples of that in other jurisdictions. So if we look at the US, for example, FINRA, which regulates brokerage firms who provide services to the public, they're actually consulting on, at the minute, a machine readable handbook. And that machine readable handbook plugs in through API integration directly to firms' compliance processes and software. So it's the absolute dream. I'd love to kind of move forward to that space. And I think this kind of ties in with, you know, like a bit of a culture and capability lens, if you look at the problem as well, because we recognize that both firms and regulators need to do quite a bit of upskilling, I would say, you know, whether that's at kind of C-suite level as well, to make sure that comfort is there in terms of deploying RegTech and also being able to supervise its use. And again, I really think we could do more to incentivize that. So we see, again, if I can draw on another international example, in Singapore, the Monetary Authority of Singapore has a RegTech grant, and they give that grant to firms who are trying to, you know, upskill their employees essentially in the use of RegTech. And it's also a bit of a quasi-reg sandbox as well, so it enables firms to kind of pilot and test new innovative kind of RegTech solutions and really kind of, you know, just push adoption. So I think that's really encouraging, and I'd love to see that be modelled in other jurisdictions. And I think if we just zoom out, and then I'd be keen to hear to Matt and Chris your thoughts. There's also kind of a wider skills and talent piece as well. You know, RegTech's really got to keep pace with, you know, changing innovation in financial services and in other sectors. And so it's really key that we, you know, have the tech and the skills there. We've got that pipeline there. So whether it's, you know, women, other underrepresented groups, or in data science or in these other areas, I think that will be key kind of long term to make sure we're systematically addressing barriers to adoption and scale, looking at the long term horizon.
Yeah, brilliant. No, that's a great set of sort of thoughts on that, and definitely would echo all of those from our perspective as well. I don't know, Chris, whether you had any sort of additional thoughts on barriers that you've sort of picked up from the report or elsewhere as well.
Well, I guess maybe a build first. So that I think I agree with everything that Rachel has said there. It's a great articulation of some of the barriers that we see as well. I suppose picking up on the role of the regulator one, again, unsurprisingly, given my role, I always enjoy a conversation about that because it is interesting, and I like the fact you brought in the global perspective there, Rachel, because it is something which is now being picked up around the world, and there's almost, aside from some of the obvious jurisdictions where perhaps you will never get convergence, we are seeing, so when I speak to regulators in different jurisdictions, you're seeing an understanding of the importance of this and a desire to engage. And I think, although obviously in the UK, I think to a certain extent we are lucky. I take your point, Rachel, they could definitely do more, but yeah, the FCA, the Bank of England are open and engaging with the industry, and indeed they've been held out as global leaders, global best practice perhaps for engagement with the industry. But that was probably, again, the world moves very quickly, so is what was leading practice in the UK still global leading practice? And there are those things that I would also like to see the FCA do more. Again, if any regulators online, great if you want to pipe up with questions, but I think there's a piece that we'll talk about later on, the data and the common standards bit, which the FCA clearly has a role in. But the other thing I think that the FCA can help with, and regulators in general, is setting expectations. They can drive a lot of the market here. We'll talk perhaps a bit more about open banking and lessons learned from that later, but driving expectations almost for technology in terms of what does fully embedded technology look like, and how are supervisors assessing whether the use of technology by firms is appropriate and is driving outcomes which can support both the firm's objectives and the regulator's objectives. And then obviously the point that you've raised, Rachel, around accelerating the regulator's own digitisation of their approach to things is a key one. So there's a lot I think the regulators can do to help with those barriers. So I think that as long as they keep talking and keep working on it, there's some benefits to be had there. So not really wishing to dwell on barriers for too long, because obviously clearly lots of barriers that we've raised, and I suppose alongside the skills and talent one, which I absolutely agree with, is a key one. The other ones I'd probably highlight would be the as I've mentioned, data standards and interoperability one. And maybe my other build on the cultural piece is I wrap up culture, op model, awareness, sort of engagement, incentivization into one sort of conundrum around actually how are the bigger financial services organizations really addressing this, and what are they doing to make sure that their organizations are making the best use of technology. And I do feel like if I wrap that sort of mega barrier up and call it something like engagement, I do believe that if we can address that, and if we're able to, if we're able to display an understanding, and if we're able to succinctly and compellingly express that desire to change within our firm senior management and at board level, that could be the single biggest thing that could move the needle on adoption levels. I think it's got the potential to really shift us from where where many of my clients are, which is innovation which is sort of around the fringes, solutions which are interesting, but they really struggle to integrate with the main firm. So I think that can move us towards a position where we've got innovation which can really unlock some of the really fantastic benefits that Onfido and lots of other RegTechs and other emerging technologies can deliver. So I guess that'd just be my thoughts on some of the barriers, Matt.
Yeah, brilliant. No, that's a great set again. So thanks, Chris, as well. I mean, I think as well, just to add to that, from our perspective, I think one of the issues that we are grappling with now, particularly in Europe, but it's definitely going to be an issue in the UK as well, is how regulators are thinking about the use of AI and biometrics in particular. And we've seen lots of discussion from different regulatory quarters on how it should be adopted, and particularly on the harms of AI. But it's really important that we have a balanced discussion about also the benefits, and also in particular the use cases for which AI is put. And for example, in the EU at the moment with the new AI Act, there's definitely the potential, at least, that low risk uses of AI that are used specifically and exclusively to combat fraud are deemed to be high risk in particular use cases, which adds a huge amount of cost and complexity and therefore barrier to scaling. And so that's definitely an area that I think not just Onfido, but the broader industry where AI is being used is looking very carefully at making sure we don't get the wrong outcomes there. Creditworthiness assessments is another area beyond verification where that sort of issue might arise, and where do you draw the line between different levels of risk in creditworthiness assessments when you're using a RegTech proposition. So that's really key. We also see barriers or certainly a patchwork effect of different countries taking a different approach to what is appropriate RegTech. So for example, in the UK, with a very sort of risk-based approach, it's very different in certain European countries. For example, in Germany, where the default is using a video type solution where you literally have to have a video conversation with someone and show your passport or your driving license or whatever. That is a very high friction, high cost proposition to verify someone's identity, whereas in fact in lots of other European countries you don't need to do that. And so again, you potentially have to take a country by country approach to meeting the solution. So those sort of things also trigger their own sort of levels of barriers as well. And then I think finally on that sort of issue, we definitely need to see a more pro-innovation approach. I mean, Rachel, you touched on this, and Chris as well. We've got, pro-innovation is a great way of sort of expressing what you really want to happen, but it's all about the practice. And so it's awesome when we see regulators taking an approach which means that industry can properly engage with them, and you have an open door to go in and discuss new solutions, new products, and certainly try and have a really proactive approach to sandboxing as well. And so you have the thing that you can actually really drive benefits without worrying about what the outcome might be and before you've done that investment. So yeah, I think there's definitely, unfortunately, we've dwelled quite a lot on this subject, but there's certainly, I think, more that can be teased out in terms of trying to flatten some of these barriers.
Yeah, well, Matt, can I come in on the sort of the AI sort of area as well? Because I think this is an area of conversation with lots of my clients around. If I sometimes shy away from using the term AI because some people have a sort of bit of an allergic reaction to it, but if we think about in the broader sense, any sort of machine learning applied to data, particularly customer data, people get very nervous. And I suppose what I'd encourage those on the call to think about within their organisations in a way that has really sort of stepped up, I think, over the last 2 or 3 years, maybe. So relatively recently, actually, I say 2 or 3 years, pandemic, that must mean it's at least 3 or 4, because I've lost those years of the pandemic. But this engagement around here, what's an appropriate use of customer data, and particularly when you're applying any sort of, as I say, statistical inference, machine learning, AI over top of that data. These are problems which I think the industry needs to face into, and we shouldn't shy away from those debates. And it's great to see the industry really sort of tackling some of these questions around what is an ethical use of customer data, how are we using data beyond just concerns around privacy and some of those core areas of legislation, moving beyond GDPR to actually what's an appropriate use of data, and how can we get to a point where these tools and solutions are producing outcomes which are beneficial to the customers, and therefore the customer is more likely to want to share data or to click that tab which says, yes, I'm prepared to do that because I understand what I'm getting to. So as I say, many of my larger clients have now, well, all the large clients have now got or getting models in place to look at some of those ethical and principle-based questions in a framework for looking at data to enable use of AI. Because, as I say, it wasn't long ago whereby I'd go and speak to boards and I would say, you know, can you tell me about some of the use cases you've got within your organisation for AI? Where are you using AI? And they wouldn't know. And if you don't know where you're using AI, then how can you understand where the risks are? So I'd say just face into that debate because there's a huge amount of potential there.
Yeah, no, that's a really nice segue into not an entirely directly relevant question, but it's certainly one that you know can follow on neatly from that in the chat from Gavin, which is with the adoption of RegTech, what happens to liability in instances with fraud? And I don't know whether either of you have any sort of thoughts on that particular question.
Yeah,
I'm happy. You know, you go first, Chris, and then I'll add on.
Sure, yeah, I mean, it's a really great question. I mean, and it does actually seg nicely from the AI question, because at the more tricky end of the liability debate, obviously you've got the sort of self-driving car liability debate, and who's going to take liability for that. But I think there are ways to eat the elephant, which probably are more potentially more resolvable than I think some of the really challenging questions there. So I think again, partly some of this needs to be cooperation across the ecosystem, and if everybody has more of a collective view around where we're trying to get to, I think you're more likely to get to a point where you have an acceptable understanding of a liability model which will work there. But I'd say it's a really difficult one, but it's going to require everyone to come together and work through these thorny issues.
Yeah, and just a thought from me on that. I think one of the areas where this is really starting to get a bit of traction and people are really starting to think about this is in the idea of digital identity. And so that's certainly an area that's very, very forward thinking in the UK, particularly with the new digital identity trust framework that's been pioneered by what was DCMS, now DCIT, to look at the idea of reusable digital identity in particular. And so the idea in the financial services sector might be that you go through a verification process with Bank A, and then you use that verification credential, if you like, to onboard to Bank B or Bank C or whatever. And to what extent can Bank B rely on the verification that was done with Bank A? And where does the liability sit in terms of an error or some sort of fraud being perpetrated? And then that could potentially happen or propagate across lots of different relying parties. And so, unfortunately, I don't think, Gavin, we've got a perfect answer to that question right now, but I think the point being that it's definitely something which in lots of different spaces related to RegTech, that has become more and more of an issue. And we need to make sure that that sort of question is cared for. And then we've all got a very clear view on how that works out to make these sort of new innovations a reality.
Yeah, and I would hope innovations can actually could help because, you know, if you think about some of the risks I see with some of the other liability sharing models around, you know, APP and some of the other sort of contentious fraud areas, you do worry what it does in terms of the fraudsters who are, you know, really rapidly evolving here. And you can't have an environment where people almost sort of wash their hands of it and go, well, I don't need to either take care of what I'm doing because I know I'm going to get my money back, or the fraudsters say, actually, well, we know we're not going to get pursued here because the controls are not weak. So I think, you know, bleeding edge fraud controls really, really important, but the liability model debate, absolutely one we need to face into.
Yeah, I was just going to build on those points and say, I think it's something that the regulators are definitely grappling with at the minute. And if we think about operational resilience, what the regulators are looking at is, you know, outsourcing to third parties. So I think, you know, we need to be thoughtful in that respect as well. If firms are outsourcing, you know, significant functions, you know, KYC, AML related, for example, to your RegTech, a third party, you know, they need to be mindful of the kind of broader discussions the regulators are having around operational resilience and ultimately where the buck stops. So it's definitely something that, you know, C-suite should be thinking about now, and they should be following closely the discussions that are playing out, certainly in the UK, on operational resilience.
Yeah. Yeah, so lots of areas to unpick going forward, but yeah, a great question on liability. Thanks for that, Gavin. Great. If we go on to the next slide, and then turning a little bit to now look into the future with our crystal balls a little bit more. Innovation, what's driving innovation in this space, and where do we think the future lies in that sense? I don't know, Rachel, if you want to kick off with any thoughts on that, if possible.
Yeah, sure. The one thing I picked out was digital assets and DLT, so distributed ledger tech, and just how that's really shaking up capital markets. So really kind of, really kind of changing up the ecosystem there, the infrastructure, and it's driving the need for real-time monitoring. And that's only going to continue. We've heard the kind of media headlines over the past kind of year or so in the digital asset space, so it becomes super important. So if you think around, the regulators' challenges, but also buy side and sell side, there's, embedding rules, tokenization of assets, tokenization of compliance, that auditability of compliance rules and obligations, linking controls to really fast moving markets as well. So I'm really interested to see how RegTech can adapt itself to the digital asset space and really kind of address some of the key issues there.
Yeah, no, that's a great sort of point. And I think certainly self-sovereign identity and thinking about what's happening to your data and privacy related to who's controlling that data and for what reasons is definitely something that is related to the digital assets point, and that's definitely something that we're looking at very closely. I don't know whether, Chris, you wanted to come in on the innovation point as well, because I'm sure you've got...
there's I suppose the answer to the question is yes. I mean, absolutely, innovation is totally essential for many of the reasons we've already covered. But to come in on the digital assets point specifically, so we, unsurprisingly, at KPMG, that we see that this is an area where our clients need a lot of help because there's lots of uncertainty. But I see almost a future of my business, my risk and regulatory business, being one that has to face into the risk and regulatory challenges, in the decentralized world. So what does an appropriate risk and regulatory framework for the decentralized world look like? These are questions which, again, our regulator and others around the world are looking into. But I think is going to be really, really interesting. The disruption that Rachel's mentioned to the capital markets area, what's going to be the impact of CBDCs? There's just so much going on. How far does the VASP regime going to go far enough from in your world, Matt? Where do we get to with actually a future state AML, fraud, fin crime on the chain, which almost definitely removes the need for your passport, but potentially totally shakes up the world of anti-financial crime and makes it better. So I think, a huge amount of potential there in DLC. So very, very supportive of that. But I suppose on this innovation question, this is almost where, Matt, to your point around being pro-innovation, our conversation could almost seg off in an entirely different webinar direction, but related webinar, because for me, it's not just about what the innovation is, it's about how you innovate. And the reality is that many firms just aren't set up or don't have the toolkits to take innovative ideas and put them into practice, in reality and at pace. So I really think that is something that we need people to be working on, because this is, it's like people talk about creativity. I'm not a creative person, but creativity, there are ways you can become more creative. There is a process there. There are processes for innovative thinking and for taking things from the ideation stage all the way through. So again, I think that's an important aspect of innovation to face into. But I guess the core question around what innovations are driving this. The other one I was going to highlight was going to be cloud, because one of the barriers we've spoken about, or actually we didn't speak about in detail here, but a commonly cited barrier is integration with legacy tech, which is a big issue. And for me, that's been it's almost felt intractable working with some of the larger retail banks who've got huge unwieldy legacy technology stacks, which make it very, very difficult to do what we would like to do in terms of any of these changes. And so the ability to use cloud and the ability to API into some of these systems and other systems is, I think, potentially going to help us see a way through some of those barriers and to overcome what previously I thought was almost an intractable problem around legacy tech there. So cloud adoption is obviously is massive already, and is, I think, going to be increasingly crucial for the RegTech adoption curve, if you like.
Yeah.
I suppose the broader point would be that we live in a VUCA world. For those of you that are familiar with the term VUCA, And if you haven't come across it, VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, which, you know, with COVID and everything else, I think hopefully most of you will agree that does pretty accurately describe the reality that we're living in right now. So if you're not solving these problems with technology in a VUCA world, with technology innovation, how are you going to solve them? I think is the fundamental sort of gauntlet I sort of lay down to some of my clients when I get difficult questions back. Yeah, I suppose that would be my thoughts on some of those core innovations, Matt.
I think cloud's a particularly interesting one, and yeah, we haven't sort of majored on that, but I think it's really interesting how different governments are thinking about the use of cloud services in the RegTech space, and whether there's a political dimension to some of those thought processes as well. Certainly something that we see quite a lot in Europe is the idea of a desire to be precluding access to customer data in the EU from sort of non-EU sources, and so there are certainly sort of initiatives going on at EU level which will probably make it harder and harder to have a one-size-fits-all solution in relation to cloud, with sort of the free-flowing data that would enable. And so definitely cloud and how you're setting up your cloud instances and your storage of data is really part of that equation as well, from our perspective. Yeah, great. Okay, so our final question, if we can go on to one more slide, and this is probably covered a little bit in what we've already talked about, but any sort of final thoughts from either of you, I guess, in relation to the trends that we're seeing, particularly in KYC and compliance and fraud, but also more generally, if you've got any thoughts on that. Maybe start with you, Rachel, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. I know I've touched on cost earlier, but I'll bring it up again. I just think the absolute cost of tackling economic crime. I read something the other day that said worldwide financial institutions are spending over 270 billion USD on it. And there was like an uptick of $60 billion kind of year on year. So it's a phenomenal amount of money. So I think just the efforts, because it's a global problem, right? Trying to tackle kind of economic crime. I just think the cost drivers there will be really key. And if we can get that right, we will absolutely see uptake for RegTech solutions. So I think cost will be a key driver.
Yeah, that's definitely, I would certainly echo that from our perspective, and cost is absolutely front and center of all of the discussions that we have with our customers in that respect. Chris, anything from your side as well that you would add to that?
I suppose, I mean, there are lots of interesting trends, and actually at this point I suppose it would be remiss for me not to plug our latest report, which is our Global Pulse of FinTech report, which actually covers the broader fintech market trends and some of these RegTech trends that we've spoken about here. So hopefully I can share a link with the group afterwards if it's not already in the chat. But yeah, absolutely, the cost and compliance trend is going to remain huge. It's not going to go away. I also expect to see a continuance of some of the other long-standing trends around not just the cost of compliance, but the use of technology to manage the volume of regulatory change, as I mentioned at the top of the call. You know, lots of the surveys that you read put horizon scanning as the #1 pain point that firms are looking to tackle with RegTech, alongside, as I say, those core areas like fraud and KYC. But that horizon scanning challenge is not going to get easier, and I feel like with the amount of components of a good regulatory change management system, including horizon scanning, there's so much opportunity in there to potentially take cost out, but also to be more efficient and to try and get on top of some of the changes that are happening in good time and avoid some of the mistakes and gaps that we've seen come to light in the past. And I suppose I think that is definitely an area that firms are looking at, because my personal experience, I'm seeing a sort of steady flow of RFPs come in, both globally and UK-based institutions asking for our help, KPMG's help in that area. And then I suppose the final, not one of the three topics we've got on there, but the final trend, or maybe it's more an emerging use case that I'd highlight, would be ESG and sustainable finance. So again, lots of interesting RegTech use cases around addressing some of the challenges, the data challenges and the broader ESG and greenwashing challenges. But our sort of research suggests that this will be the fastest growing subsector within the overall rapidly growing RegTech subsector. And again, there's a whole other webinar on the topic of sustainable finance and RegTech. But I suppose I'll just seed that with your audience, Matt, and they can go and sort of do some reading on that and come back to us with other questions if they want. But
Yeah.
no, I think we could talk about any of the trends, Matt, that we've got. But I think they'd be my main ones. I think we've covered the key ones.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they all completely are up there in terms of importance. And I think the other one from our perspective is standards, and the extent to which standards are going to be a driving factor in making sure that we've got good user trust and user adoption in this space as well. I mean, from our perspective, we're seeing the digital trust framework I mentioned earlier in the UK setting standards for identity service providers, but also the standards in the EU on the toolbox from the eIDAS regulation as well will definitely play a driving role, I think, in the adoption of some of these new RegTech solutions that can come to market as well. So the ability to meet those standards, and then I think if you're a global company, how you're thinking about which standards to meet, whether there's any sort of efficiency to be gained in meeting certain standards and influencing those standards as well is absolutely key. No, that's great. So this is a fantastic discussion. If anyone listening has any final questions that they want to put to myself or Rachel or Chris, do feel free to put them in the last 5 or so minutes that we've got. But while we're waiting for anything else to come in, I'd love to get both of your thoughts just on the international picture, if possible. I know we've sort of touched a little bit on the international stage, but do you see any sort of divergence happening or indeed sort of a convergence happening in the way that different international bodies are thinking about any of these issues? Rachel, you mentioned Singapore as a sort of a really good case study in what good looks like. I don't know if you have any thoughts on other international phenomena that you're seeing that might be worth flagging.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's just to recognize that globally they are shared challenges. So, we've mentioned compliance, KYC, fraud prevention. They're global issues. And we can see that the regulators who participate in the global financial innovation network, GFIN, are really kind of doubling down on some of these areas. And they're really kind of putting a focus on RegTech and on supervisory technology solutions. So there's definitely work ongoing, but I think, as I alluded to earlier, I'd just love to see that go a little bit further and faster. In the US, I gave that example of FINRA and the machine-readable rulebooks. It would be great to do that. I mean, we need to do it in a thoughtful way, because in the UK, what's really positive about the direction of travel of our regulatory rulebooks is that they're moving to outcomes-based rules rather than really kind of granular rules that lead to more kind of tick box compliance and that actually hinders innovation. So I think a really thoughtful approach to digitizing rulebooks, making them machine readable, machine executable would be fab. So we're seeing movement in that space, but it's just how can we work together to make that go a little bit further and faster would be my key takeaway.
Yeah, great insight there. I don't know, Chris, as well, from your perspective, do you see any international examples of best practice or areas that others can learn from?
Yeah, I mean, I see a lot of positives in the international approach to innovation and RegTech and subtech supervisory technology. I see more and more regulators wanting to hold themselves out, even if they're not in tier 1, G7 countries. They're trying to take an approach which is, we understand that either for sovereign reasons or because their markets are demanding it, they want to promote innovation. So I am seeing a little bit of convergence. Actually, I've just come back from a trip to the Middle East, where some of the regulators over there are progressing very, very rapidly in this space, as well as the learning lessons from us in the UK and from the Far East. Rachel's mentioned HKMA and MAS, the great work they've done over there, and I'm seeing a little bit of convergence when I talk to regulators that there's some common themes coming up around. Okay, we know we need to, and there's overlap here with what we do from RegTech from a perspective of the FIs. So the regulators themselves and at national level, they recognise they need to boost awareness, and they recognise they need to engage with the ecosystem. So both from government and regulators are all recognising that no one can go this alone. They recognise that they need to be participating in the ecosystem and having that dialogue It's not just enough to be sort of issuing diktats. You need to have the tech sprints. You need to be going out. You need to be engaging with the startups as well as with the incumbents. They're recognising the talent issue that Rachel's spoken about. There's clear focus at national levels, I think, on developing talent pools, attracting talent in a globally competitive market. And so I think that piece there around, okay, what skills are needed and how do you get them into your country and in-house is important. And then there's the piece around actually how you sustain that adoption, and partly that is the ongoing dialogue. Part of it is actually what's in it for the institutions themselves. So I think we're seeing a great number of positives. Again, from the UK perspective, I think this is great stuff we're doing. But that global convergence around, okay, we need to do stuff here to promote RegTech adoption. You know, banks and other financial institutions have got lots of other competing priorities for where they're going to apply resources, particularly you know, in Western countries. So it's really competitive to get hold of those investment pounds and dollars, and it's great to see that people are feeling that they've got more of a role to play in accessing those dollars and making sure that they're doing all they can to increase the resources that are applied, both monetary resources and people resources are being applied to RegTech. So yeah, I think there is some convergence, Matt, but it's obviously it's definitely not perfect. So other countries are obviously doing their own thing in some of those areas I've mentioned before, where typically it's difficult to get convergence.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic to see those little pockets of good practice, and they're becoming more prevalent. Definitely, that would also be my observation. It's just a question of making sure that, you know, we're taking that great best practice and sort of trying to propagate it into different places, and also, yeah, bring up those other countries which potentially have a difficulty overcoming some of their reservations to try and get them into a more progressive mindset as well. So a continuing challenge, but certainly lots to pick through. So we're pretty much at the top of the hour. Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you so much, Chris. Fascinating discussion. I hope that was useful and interesting for those listening. Our contact details for each of our organisations are on the screen. Yeah, look forward to speaking about this again soon. So thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks all.